Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished loading the last bags of corn into his old red pickup truck. The September evening was warm and humid in Nebraska, the kind of weather that made him grateful for the cold beer waiting in his kitchen. He had been farming this land for 37 years, ever since his father passed away and left him the family farm. The corn had grown well this season, tall and golden, swaying gently in the evening breeze. He walked toward his barn to check on the equipment one more time before calling it a day. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jake loved this time of day when the work was done and the land seemed peaceful and quiet. His wife Martha would have dinner ready soon, probably her famous pot roast with vegetables from their garden. As Jake reached for the barn door, a strange humming sound filled the air. It was low and deep, unlike anything he had ever heard before. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, making the ground vibrate beneath his boots. He looked up at the sky and froze in place. 3 large objects hung in the air above his cornfield. They were dark and smooth, shaped like teardrops, and they glowed with a soft blue light. Jake had lived in Nebraska all his life and had seen plenty of aircraft, from small planes to military jets, but these things were different. They moved without sound except for that strange humming, floating in the air like leaves on water. Jake reached into his pocket for his phone to call the sheriff, but before he could dial, a beam of bright white light shot down from the closest object. The light was so bright it made his eyes water and his head spin. He tried to run toward the house to warn Martha, but his legs felt heavy and slow, as if he was walking through thick mud. The humming sound grew louder, and Jake felt his vision getting blurry. 3 tall figures appeared in the light, walking toward him with long, smooth steps. As they got closer, Jake could see they were not human. They stood 7 feet tall with thin bodies and long arms. Their skin was blue like the ocean on a clear day, and their heads were larger than a human head, with big black eyes that reflected the light. One of the creatures raised its hand, and Jake felt a sharp pain in his neck like a bee sting. His body became numb and heavy, and he fell to his knees in the dirt. He tried to call out for Martha, but no sound came from his mouth. The creatures surrounded him, speaking to each other in a language that sounded like whispers and clicks. The tallest creature, who seemed to be their leader, examined Jake like he was looking at a piece of farm equipment. He held a small device that beeped and flashed as he pointed it at Jake. The creature nodded to the others and made more clicking sounds. Jake tried to fight back, tried to stand up, but his body would not obey his mind. 2 of the creatures lifted Jake easily, as if he weighed no more than a bag of grain. They carried him toward the beam of light, and Jake felt himself being pulled upward, floating through the air toward the dark object above. As they rose higher, Jake could see his farm getting smaller below him. He could see Martha through the kitchen window, setting plates on the table, not knowing that her husband was being taken away. Inside the strange craft, Jake was placed on a cold metal table. The walls were smooth and white, covered with lights, and panels that blinked in patterns he did not understand. The air smelled clean but strange, like the inside of a hospital, but with an odd metallic taste. The creatures moved around him with purpose, checking their devices and making their clicking sounds. The leader approached Jake with what looked like a small gun. Jake tried to move away but could only twitch his fingers. The creature pressed the device against Jake's arm, and Jake felt another sharp pain. This time, the pain spread through his whole body, and darkness crept in from the edges of his vision before he lost consciousness. Jake heard one of the creatures speak in broken English. The voice was high and thin, like air whistling through a crack in a window. Subject acquired. Primitive agricultural specimen, suitable for biological research program. Transport to facility Kepler 442C authorized. Jake wanted to tell them they were wrong, that he was not some simple farm animal they could take and study. He wanted to fight back, to show them that humans were not as weak as they thought. But the darkness took him, and Jake Morrison, farmer from Nebraska, disappeared into the night sky, leaving behind only the smell of corn and the sound of crickets in his empty fields. When Martha came out to call Jake for dinner, she found only his hat lying in the dirt beside the barn. The corn still swayed in the evening breeze, and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, but Jake was gone. The only sign that something unusual had happened was a circular patch of burnt grass in the cornfield and a strange metallic taste in the air that lingered until morning. Far above Earth, Jake lay unconscious in the alien ship as it traveled faster than light toward a distant star system. The creatures who had taken him believed they had captured a simple farmer, a primitive being who would provide useful data for their research. They had no idea that they had just made the biggest mistake in the history of their empire, a mistake that would change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. Jake woke up on a cold metal floor in a room with white walls and no windows. His head felt heavy and his mouth was dry like sand. The air tasted different here, clean but wrong, like breathing inside a machine. He sat up slowly and looked around. The room was small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, with a single door that had no handle on his side. In one corner was a bowl of water and what looked like food pellets, brown and round like dog food. Jake's stomach growled, but he did not touch the pellets yet. His father had taught him to be careful about food from strangers. Even when he was very hungry, through a small opening near the ceiling, Jake could hear sounds from other rooms. Voices. Speaking in languages he did not know, some high and musical, others low and growling. He realized he was not the only prisoner in this place. The door opened with a soft hiss, and one of the blue creatures entered. This one was smaller than the others Jake had seen and wore what looked like a white coat. She carried a flat device that glowed with symbols and numbers. The creature looked at Jake with those big black eyes and made clicking sounds. "You awake now," she said in broken English, her voice high and thin. "I am Dr. Kiriana. You are test subject 774. You will answer questions." Jake stood up slowly, keeping his hands visible. He had dealt with difficult animals on the farm and knew that sudden movements could make things worse. "My name is Jake Morrison," he said quietly. "Where am I and why? Did you take me from my home?" Dr. Kiriana tilted her head like a bird watching a bug. "Name not important. You are specimen from planet Earth, agricultural class, simple mind, good for study." She touched her device and the symbols changed. "You will eat food pellets. You will sleep when lights go dark. You will answer questions when I come." Jake looked at the pellets again. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about your planet, about your species behavior, about your farming methods." She made more clicking sounds, which Jake was starting to think might be laughter. "You primitive people, very interesting to study." Over the next few days, Dr. Kiriana came to Jake's cell many times. She asked him about how humans grew food, how they organized their societies, how they solved problems. Jake answered carefully. Watching her reactions, learning about her as much as she was learning about him, he discovered that the creatures were called Zephyrians and they ruled over many planets and species across the galaxy. They took beings from other worlds to study them and learn about their weaknesses. The information was used to help the Zephyrian Empire control and exploit new worlds they conquered. Jake also learned that Dr. Kiriana was young for her species and not very important in their society. She was trying to prove herself by studying primitive species like humans. She believed Jake was simple and stupid because he came from a farming background, but Jake could see she was not very smart herself during his second week in captivity. Jake heard a commotion in the corridor outside his cell. Guards were dragging a new prisoner past his door, something that looked like a large lizard walking on 2 legs. Later, when the guards were gone, Jake called out softly through his door, "Hello? Are you okay in there?" A deep, gravelly voice answered from the next cell. "I am alive, human. My name is Seth. I am engineer from Drakmore system. Zephyrians destroy my ship, take me for experiments." Over the following days, Jake and Seth talked whenever the guards were not around. Seth told Jake about the galaxy, about the Zephyrian Empire, and how it worked. The Zephyrians were not the strongest or smartest species in space, but they had advanced technology and were very organized. They conquered other worlds by studying their people first, then exploiting their weaknesses. Seth also told Jake about other prisoners in the facility. There was Harmony, a being made of living crystal who could sing in frequencies that affected electronics. There was Grix, a small furry creature who could see magnetic fields. There were dozens of others, all taken from their homes to be studied and tested. Jake learned that the Zephyrian society was built like a pyramid. At the top were the High Council and the military commanders. Below them were scientists like Dr. Kiriana. At the bottom were worker drones who did all the manual labor. Every Zephyrian knew their place and never questioned orders from above. The Empire was powered by a rare mineral called quintessium, which could store enormous amounts of energy. The Zephyrians had to constantly find new sources of quintessium to power their technology and expand their empire. This meant they were always looking for new worlds to strip mine and exploit. As Jake listened to all this information, he began to understand something that the Zephyrians did not. Their empire was like a crop that takes all the nutrients from the soil without giving anything back. Eventually the soil becomes useless and the crop dies. The Zephyrians were destroying the very thing that kept them alive. During his talks with Dr. Kariana, Jake began asking his own questions. He wanted to know how Zephyrian agriculture worked, how they managed their resources, how they planned for the future. Dr. Kariana answered proudly, not realizing that she was giving Jake information he could use. Jake learned that the Zephyrians had no concept of sustainable farming or resource management. They simply took what they needed and moved on when resources ran out. Their food was grown in artificial environments using chemicals and energy, never recycling nutrients or thinking about long-term soil health. To Dr. Kiriana, this proved how advanced her people were compared to primitive farmers like Jake, but Jake could see the fatal flaw in their system. They were like a parasite that kills its host, not understanding that when the host dies, the parasite dies too. Jake also learned about the facility where he was being held. It was built on a moon rich in quintessium, orbiting a gas giant 3 star systems away from Earth. The facility had hundreds of prisoners and dozens of research laboratories. It was powered by a central reactor that processed raw quintessium into usable energy. Every day, Jake absorbed more information while appearing to be just a simple, confused farmer. He memorized the layout of the facility, the routines of the guards, the schedules of the scientists. He learned which Zephyrians were important and which were just following orders. Most importantly, he began to form a plan. After 6 months of captivity, Jake had become something the Zephyrians never expected. While they saw him as just another test subject, the other prisoners had begun to look to him for leadership. Through whispered conversations in the corridors and coded taps on cell walls, Jake had built a network of communication among the captives. Seth, the engineer, had taught Jake about the facility's technical systems. Harmony, the crystal being, had shown him how certain frequencies could disrupt Zephyrian electronics. Grix, the small furry creature, had mapped the guard rotation patterns. Dozens of other prisoners, each with their own skills and knowledge, had shared information with the quiet human farmer, who listened more than he spoke. Jake had also learned something crucial about Zephyrian psychology. During his sessions with Dr. Kiriana, the blue-skinned aliens were so convinced of their own superiority that they could not imagine being outsmarted by what they considered primitive species. This blind arrogance was their greatest weakness. Dr. Kiriana continued her regular visits, still believing she was studying a simple farm worker. Today we discuss crop rotation, she said, settling into her chair with her glowing tablet. Explain why you humans plant different crops in sequence. Jake pretended to struggle with the concept. Well, my daddy always said you got to give the soil a rest. Corn takes a lot of nitrogen, so next year we plant soybeans because they put nitrogen back. Primitive superstition? Dr. Kariana clicked dismissively. Zephyrian agriculture uses chemical supplements? Much more efficient than your soil rotation nonsense. But Jake had learned enough about their system to know the truth. The Zephyrians pumped their growing areas full of artificial nutrients without understanding the complex relationships between plants, soil, and the tiny organisms that kept everything in balance. Their method worked for a while, but eventually, poisoned growing medium, forcing them to constantly find new sources of fertile soil on conquered worlds. How long can your growing areas produce food? Jake asked innocently. Indefinitely, with proper chemical management, Dr. Kiriana replied proudly. Unlike your primitive methods that depend on natural soil conditions. Jake nodded as if impressed, but he was storing this information away. The Zephyrians did not understand that they were slowly destroying their own food production systems. They were like farmers who burned their fields every year and wondered why the harvests kept getting smaller during his work periods. When prisoners were forced to clean and maintain parts of the facility, Jake began implementing the first phase of his plan. He started small, introducing tiny amounts of organic material into the Zephyrian food production systems. A few drops of contaminated water here, some bacteria from the cleaning supplies there. To the Zephyrians, these were harmless accidents by clumsy prisoners. But Jake knew that in a closed system like their facility, even small changes could grow into big problems. Just like how a single diseased plant could spread infection through an entire field if conditions were right, Jake also began teaching the other prisoners about organization and patience. Many of them were warriors or leaders from their own worlds, used to fighting directly against their enemies. But Jake showed them a different way, the way of a farmer who waits for the right season, who prepares the ground carefully before planting seeds. We don't need to overpower them, Jake explained to Seth during a whispered conversation in the exercise yard. We just need to understand their system better than they do. Every system has weak points, like how a whole tree can die if you damage the right root. Seth's reptilian features showed skepticism. Zephyrians have superior technology and weapons? How can we defeat them with farming knowledge? Same way water defeats stone, Jake replied. Not by hitting it hard, but by finding the cracks and expanding them slowly until the whole thing falls apart. Jake had identified the facility's critical weakness through his conversations with Dr. Kiriana and his observations during work duty. The entire complex depended on a single quintessium processing center that powered everything from life support to security systems. The Zephyrians had built it deep underground, believing it was perfectly safe. But Jake understood something about energy systems that the Zephyrians had missed. The processing center was like the heart of a living organism. If you could disrupt its function at just the right moment, the whole body would shut down. Over several weeks, Jake organized the prisoners into work groups, each with a specific task. To the guards, they appeared to be cleaning and maintaining the facility as ordered. In reality, they were positioning themselves for a coordinated action that would require split-second timing, harmony. Learn to modulate her crystalline singing to specific frequencies that could interfere with Zephyrian communication systems. Grix memorized the locations of all security cameras and their blind spots. Seth identified backup power systems and emergency protocols. Other prisoners gathered materials and information that would be needed when the time came. Dr. Kiriana remained completely unaware of these preparations. During their sessions, she continued to gather data about human agriculture, convinced that she was learning about primitive farming techniques that proved Zephyrian superiority. Your species wastes much energy on inefficient food production, she noted during one session. Zephyrian methods use 90% less labor and produce 3 times more calories per unit of space, Jake nodded thoughtfully. That sounds real. Smart. How long have your people been using these methods? For over 200 years, Dr. Kiriana replied proudly. Since we conquered the Milleran system and acquired their agricultural technology, and before that? Before that, Zephyrians were a minor species with limited resources, she admitted. But we learned to adapt and improve ourselves through conquest and assimilation of other species' knowledge. Jake filed this information away with everything else he had learned. The Zephyrians were not naturally advanced. They had stolen their technology from the species they conquered, including their current agricultural systems. This meant they did not truly understand how their own systems worked, only how to operate them. This was exactly the kind of weakness Jake had been looking for. The Zephyrians were like farmers who had bought expensive equipment without learning how to maintain it. When something went wrong, they would not know how to fix it themselves. As the weeks passed, Jake's contamination of the food production systems began to show results. Yields decreased slightly, and some areas developed unusual molds and bacterial growths. The Zephyrian technicians tried to fix the problems with more chemicals, but this only made things worse, just as Jake had expected. Dr. Kiriana mentioned these problems during one of their sessions, complaining about inefficient facility maintenance. "Perhaps we should acquire some agricultural slaves from your planet," she mused. "Simple manual labor might be more reliable than our automated systems." Jake suppressed a smile. The Zephyrians still thought of him as primitive manual labor, never suspecting that he was the cause of their agricultural problems. Soon, he would show them what this simple farmer could really accomplish when he put his mind to it. The facility's alarm started wailing on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Jake had implemented the final phase of his plan. The Zephyrian food production systems were failing rapidly, contaminated with carefully introduced organisms that Jake had cultivated in hidden corners of his cell. What had started as small patches of mold had grown into a facility-wide crisis that threatened to poison the entire food supply. Commander Vexstar, the facility's military leader, stormed through the corridors with his blue skin flushed dark with anger. He was a tall, imposing Zephyrian with scars across his face from previous military campaigns. Behind him followed Dr. Kiriana and several other scientists, all clicking frantically in their native language. "How did this contamination spread so quickly?" Vexstar demanded as they passed Jake's cell. "Your reports indicated these primitive organisms were contained." Dr. Kiriana's translator device struggled with her rapid speech. "Unknown pathogen, sir. Spreads through air and water systems, resistant to all standard sterilization procedures. Recommend immediate facility evacuation." Jake listened from his cell, feeling a grim satisfaction. The contamination was based on principles he had learned from dealing with crop diseases back in Nebraska. Sometimes the best way to get rid of an invasive species was to introduce a more aggressive one that could outcompete it for resources. At exactly noon, when the facility's power systems were running at peak load to deal with the contamination crisis, Harmony began to sing. Her crystalline voice resonated through the metal walls and corridors, creating frequencies that interfered with Zephyrian electronics. Security systems flickered and communication networks experienced cascading failures. The cell doors opened automatically as their electronic locks malfunctioned. Jake stepped out into the corridor and found Seth already waiting, along with dozens of other prisoners. They moved quickly and quietly, following the escape routes Jake had planned during months of careful observation. "Phase 2, Jake whispered to Seth as they reached a maintenance corridor. "You know what to do?" Seth nodded and led a group of prisoners toward the facility's backup power systems. Their job was to ensure that once the main power went down, it would stay down. Meanwhile, Jake led the remaining prisoners deeper into the facility, toward the quintessium processing center that powered everything. The corridors were chaos as Zephyrian technicians ran back and forth, trying to restore their failing systems. Most of them ignored the escaped prisoners, assuming they were work crews responding to the emergency. Jake's group moved through the facility like they belonged there, using service tunnels and maintenance passages that the guards had never bothered to secure properly. They reached the processing center without encountering serious resistance. The massive chamber stretched deep underground, filled with humming machinery that converted raw quintessium into usable energy. Streams of liquid energy flowed through transparent tubes, pulsing with blue-white light that hurt to look at directly. Jake had studied this chamber during his work assignments, learning how the system functioned by asking innocent questions and observing the technicians. The Zephyrians had built it to be efficient and powerful, but not necessarily stable. Like many complex systems, it had critical points where small changes could cause catastrophic failures. Grick scurried ahead, his small size allowing him to access control panels that were built for taller species. His natural ability to see magnetic fields helped him identify the most important circuits and connections. "Energy flows concentrated here," he chittered. Pointing at a junction where multiple power conduits converged, Jake nodded and began implementing the plan he had developed over months of patient observation. Using tools improvised from maintenance equipment, he began systematically disrupting the energy flow patterns. This was not random sabotage but carefully calculated interference, based on his understanding of how energy moved through complex systems. On the surface, alarms continued to wail as the facility's problems multiplied. The food contamination had spread to the water recycling systems, and Harmony's sonic interference was causing electronics to fail throughout the complex. Commander Vexstar was trying to coordinate a response while dealing with multiple crises at once. "Sir, we have reports of escaped prisoners in Sector 7, a guard reported through static-filled communications. And food production is completely offline," added Dr. Kiriana. "We need immediate evacuation of all non-essential personnel." "Negative," Vexstar replied grimly. "This facility contains too much valuable research to abandon. Deploy all security teams to recapture the prisoners. Priority target is the human specimen 774. But by the time the security teams reached the processing center, Jake had already completed his work. The quintessium reactor was entering what engineers call a cascade failure, where each malfunction triggered additional problems in an accelerating chain reaction. Jake and his team retreated through service tunnels as the first explosions began. These were not violent blasts, but rather implosions as the carefully balanced energy systems collapsed in on themselves. The quintessium processing equipment, designed to contain enormous energies, turned those energies inward when the containment failed. The facility shook as underground chambers collapsed and energy conduits ruptured. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as backup power systems failed one by one. Jake led the escaped prisoners toward the docking bays where Zephyrian transport ships were kept. Commander Vexstar appeared in the main corridor, blocking their path with a squad of armed guards. His black eyes reflected the emergency lighting as he raised his weapon toward Jake. "You did this, human. Somehow you caused all of this destruction." Jake stopped walking and looked directly at the Zephyrian commander. "Yes, I did. Your people made a mistake when you decided to study me instead of trying to understand me. Impossible. You are a primitive agricultural specimen. You lack the knowledge to sabotage our technology." "That's where you're wrong," Jake replied calmly. "Farming isn't just about growing crops. It's about understanding how complex systems work, how energy flows through living networks, how to make small changes that create big results over time. Your empire is just another kind of ecosystem, and ecosystems can be managed." Vexstar's weapon wavered as the facility shook again from another implosion. "What have you done to our processing center?" "Same thing I'd do to any invasive species that was destroying the balance of nature," Jake said. "I introduced a more aggressive competitor and let natural processes take their course. Your quintessium reactor is eating itself from the inside out, and there's nothing you can do to stop it now." The Zephyrian commander's face showed something Jake had never seen before in their species: fear and confusion. For the first time, Vexstar was facing a problem that could not be solved with superior technology or military force. Behind Jake, Harmony's song reached a new pitch that shattered the remaining electronic systems in the corridor. The lights went out completely, leaving only the blue glow of unstable quintessium energy leaking from damaged conduits. In the darkness, Jake and the other prisoners disappeared into the maze of corridors they had memorized during their captivity. They reached the docking bay as the final phase of the cascade failure began. The facility's main reactor chamber imploded completely, creating a chain reaction that would render the moon's entire quintessium deposit unusable for generations. Jake had not just destroyed a research facility, he had eliminated one of the Empire's most important energy sources. As their stolen transport ship lifted off from the dying facility, Jake looked back at the moon that had been his prison. Explosions of light marked the locations where quintessium processing equipment was failing throughout the underground complex. The contamination he had introduced would spread to other parts of the Zephyrian supply chain, causing food shortages. and system failures across multiple worlds. But more importantly, the destruction of this facility would send a message to every oppressed species in the galaxy. The Zephyrian Empire was not invincible, and their technology was not magic. With patience, planning, and understanding of natural systems, even the most primitive species could strike back effectively. Jake Morrison, farmer from Nebraska, had just fired the first shot in a galactic war of liberation. 8 months later, Jake Morrison stood in his cornfield watching the sunrise over Nebraska, but he was no longer the simple farmer who had been abducted from this same spot. The man who had returned to Earth carried the hopes of dozens of species, and the knowledge of technologies that could change the balance of power in the galaxy. His old red barn had been transformed into a communications center that connected resistance movements across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. Sophisticated equipment, built with help from Seth and other alien engineers, was carefully hidden behind bales of hay and farming equipment. To any casual observer, it still looked like a working farm, which was exactly what Jake wanted. Martha Morrison had adapted to their new reality with the same practical wisdom that had made her a perfect farmer's wife for 37 years. She now coordinated supply shipments and safe house networks while tending her vegetable garden. Their daughter Katie had returned from college to help run what had become the unofficial headquarters of an interstellar rebellion. "Dad, we're getting reports from the Centauri sector," Katie said as she entered the barn with a tablet displaying encrypted messages. 3 more Zephyrian mining colonies have gone offline. The contamination protocols you developed are spreading faster than they can contain. Jake nodded as he reviewed the data. The biological weapons he had created were not designed to kill, but to disrupt the Zephyrian industrial systems that depended on stable, sterile environments. Food production facilities, mineral processing plants, and energy refineries were failing across the Empire as carefully engineered organisms spread through their supply chains. "Any word from Harmony and the Crystal Singers?" Jake asked. "They've successfully infiltrated the Zephyrian communication network on Rigel 7, Commander. Vexstar is trying to coordinate a response, but every time they restore communications, Harmony's frequency disruptions knock them out again." The success of their campaign was not just about sabotage and disruption. Jake had realized early on that the key to defeating the Zephyrian Empire was not to destroy it, but to transform it. Many Zephyrians were beginning to question their society's rigid hierarchy and endless conquest as they faced problems their traditional methods could not solve. Dr. Cariana had been among the first to defect. She had arrived on Earth 3 months earlier, seeking asylum and offering to share Zephyrian scientific knowledge in exchange for Jake's protection. She had finally understood that her primitive test subject had been teaching her lessons about sustainable systems that her advanced civilization desperately needed to learn. "The agricultural techniques you demonstrated have revolutionized food production on 17 worlds," she reported during their weekly briefings. "Crop yields have increased 40% while reducing resource consumption. Many Zephyrian colonies are requesting training in what they call human farming methods." Jake smiled at the irony. "The techniques Dr. Cariana thought were revolutionary were just basic crop rotation and soil management that any Earth farmer would recognize." The Zephyrians had become so dependent on artificial systems that they had forgotten the fundamental principles of working with nature instead of against it. But the real transformation was happening among the younger generation of Zephyrians, who had grown tired of constant warfare and resource depletion. Secret communication networks carried Jake's teachings about sustainable development and cooperative resource management. Zephyrian scientists were beginning to study ecosystem balance and long-term planning instead of just short-term exploitation. The resistance movement had grown far beyond what Jake had originally imagined. Seth commanded a fleet of liberated ships crewed by former slaves and prisoners from dozens of species. Grix had become a master of electronic warfare, coordinating cyber attacks across the galaxy. Harmony led a network of saboteurs who could infiltrate any system that relied on electronic communications, but it was the human approach to warfare that had made the difference. Instead of trying to match Zephyrian technology with superior weapons, Jake had taught the resistance to use patience, planning, and understanding of systems to achieve maximum impact with minimum resources. On this particular morning, Jake was expecting an important visitor. A Zephyrian fleet had been detected at the edge of the solar system, but these were not invasion ships. Commander Vexstar himself was coming to Earth under a flag of truce, seeking to negotiate an end to the conflict that was tearing his empire apart. The meeting took place in Jake's kitchen, around the same table where Martha had been setting dinner. Plates on the night he was abducted? Commander Vexstar looked uncomfortable sitting in a simple wooden chair, his tall frame making the furniture seem tiny. Dr. Cariana served as translator. Though Vexstar had learned enough English to communicate directly, "You have destroyed our civilization," Vexstar said bluntly. "Food production systems are failing. Mining operations are contaminated. Our communication networks are compromised. Worlds that have been loyal for generations are declaring independence." Jake poured coffee into 2 cups and pushed one across the table to the Zephyrian commander. "Your civilization was destroying itself long before I came along. I just helped it happen faster. You are asking us to abandon everything that made us powerful. I'm asking you to learn how to be powerful without destroying everything around you," Jake replied. "A farmer who burns his fields might get one good harvest, but then he has nothing left to grow on. Your empire has been burning its fields for hundreds of years." Vexstar stared at the coffee cup without drinking. "What you propose is impossible. Zephyrian society is built on hierarchy and conquest. We cannot simply change our nature. Every species in the galaxy thought humans were just simple farmers," Jake said. "Even I thought that was all I was. But sometimes you don't know what you're capable of until circumstances force you to find out. Your people are capable of more than you think." Outside the kitchen window, they could see an unusual sight: human children playing with young Zephyrians, crystal beings, and reptilian Drakmorians in the yard beside Martha's vegetable garden. These were the offspring of refugees and defectors who had found sanctuary on Earth, growing up together in ways their parent species had never imagined possible. "This is what I'm offering," Jake continued. "A chance to be part of something that builds instead of destroys. A confederation where every species contributes what they do best instead of being forced to serve the strongest." Vexstar finally tasted the coffee and made a face at the bitter flavor. "And if we refuse? Then your empire continues to collapse from the inside while the rest of the galaxy learns to work together without you. Either way, the age of Zephyrian domination is over. The only question is whether your people will be part of what comes next, or whether they'll keep fighting a war they can't win." Vexstar was quiet for a long time, watching the children play through the window. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, less commanding and more thoughtful. "My own offspring are among the rebels on Zephyr Prime. They tell me that traditional Zephyrian methods are outdated, that we must learn from other species instead of conquering them. I thought they were corrupted by alien ideas. Maybe they were just smart enough to see that cooperation works better than domination," Jake suggested. "Your children understand something that took me years to learn on the farm. The strongest ecosystems are the ones with the most diversity, where every organism has a role to play." Over the next 3 days, representatives from across the galaxy arrived at Jake's farm for what would later be called the Nebraska Accords. Species that had been enemies for centuries sat together in Martha's kitchen, sharing meals and working out the framework for a new kind of interstellar government. The Zephyrian Empire officially dissolved on a Thursday afternoon, replaced by the Galactic Confederation. Commander Vexstar signed the documents with a traditional human pen, symbolically ending his people's military dominance and beginning their participation as equals in a cooperative alliance. Jake found himself elected as the first coordinator of the Confederation, though he insisted the position would rotate among species every 2 years. His first official act was to establish agricultural exchange programs that would teach sustainable farming techniques to worlds that had been strip-mined by the old empire. 6 months later, Jake stood in his cornfield again, but now the corn was joined by crops from dozens of worlds. Zephyrian nutrition grains grew beside Drakmorian root vegetables and crystalline energy fruits from Harmony's homeworld. The field had become a living symbol of what cooperation could accomplish. Dr. Kiriana had become his chief agricultural advisor, helping to adapt farming techniques for different alien biologies and planetary conditions. She often marveled at how much she had learned from the primitive human she had once studied as a test subject. The food production increases have exceeded all projections, she reported during their evening walk through the experimental fields. 17 worlds that were facing starvation under Zephyrian rule are now food exporters. The techniques you've developed are being called Morrison protocols across the galaxy. Jake chuckled at that. Just basic farming sense that my daddy taught me. Amazing what you can accomplish when you stop fighting the land and start working.